Welcome to this video, which is going to introduce you to a new project which I've just finished, having worked for 19 years on it, and which is going to come out as a monograph with the publisher Ashgate in July 2011. The title of the book will be Christ's Resurrection in Early Christianity and the Making of the New Testament. And it's a simple question which I'm going to pursue and try to answer. What role did Christ's resurrection play in early Christianity? Instead of addressing the historical question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, I ask, when, to whom and why was it important for Christians to confess the risen Christ? How did this tenet impact on Christian writings on the New Testament and the Creed, not as a marginal note like Pontius Pilate or as a point of controversy as with the Virgin Mary, but as one of the most central and foundational beliefs on which Christianity and all its churches rest? The belief that Jesus did in fact rise from death as the basis of the faith of the Christian community, unparalleled in the religions of antiquity. Or are other scholars right, who suggest that not the resurrection, but that other beliefs have been core in the beginnings of Christianity, for example, the crucifixion? In his recent book on the resurrection of Christ, Geza Vermes claims that despite Paul's adamant belief in the resurrection, one faces the big surprise that, as he writes, quote, general pronouncements by Jesus on resurrection are few and far between, and the resurrection of Christ does not appear to have had a major doctrinal impact on the Gospels. Neither the general background material nor the teaching ascribed to Jesus on the afterlife is particularly concerned with the matter. Paul is the first to raise the question, but he does so more from a pragmatic than from a theoretical viewpoint. So far, Vermes. My own thesis supports that of Vermes, but also differs from it and from any older position as far as I can see. It has evolved, as I said, from years of study and resulted in the following observation. A prior fall, or maybe rather say a decline, in interest triggered at the end the rise of the risen Christ. Although a strong belief in Paul, as Vermes suggested, the resurrection was even of lesser importance to most early Christians than it was to the Gospel writers. There is a strong link between Paul and the resurrection. But with the waning of Paul's theological popularity after his death, which lasted for decades, and his sudden comeback only towards the middle of the 2nd century, this comeback steered Christian thinking about the resurrection of Christ. Christians did not adopt, probably no longer understood, the radicalism of Paul once he had died. Over 100 years later, we can still sense the somewhat defensive manner, for example, with which Irenaeus of Lyon handles Paul. Paul, together with his belief in the resurrection, had been discovered only a few decades earlier by an outstanding Christian teacher at Rome, Marcion of Sinope. Irenaeus maintains Paul's integrity, but he is very critical when he states the following. It is necessary to examine the opinion of Paul, to explain what has received an interpretation from heretics who have altogether misunderstood what Paul has spoken, and to point out the folly of their mad opinions, and to demonstrate from that same Paul, from whose writings they press questions upon us, that there are indeed utterers of falsehood, but that the apostle was a preacher of the truth. A position even harsher than that of Irenaeus is taken just a few years later by Tertullian in his work against Marcion. Tertullian takes as his benchmark the Gospel, and correctly notes that there is no trace of Paul in its list of apostles. Therefore, Marcion's claim that Paul is of authority, the only authority, and that this authority he derived from the risen, suggests for Tertullian that Christ lacked foresight and did not know beforehand that he would have need of Paul. And he writes, "Shipmaster," he says, "out of Pontus, Marcion, will you please let us know under what bill of lading you accepted Paul as apostle? Who had stamped him with that mark of distinction? Who commended him to you? Who put him in your charge? Only so may you, with confidence, disembark him. Only so can he avoid being proved to belong to him who has put in evidence all the documents that attest his apostleship." He himself, says Marcion, claims to be an apostle, and that not from men, not from any man, but through Jesus Christ. Clearly, any man can make claims for himself, but his claim is confirmed by another person's attestation. One person writes the document, another signs it, a third attests the signature, and a fourth enters it in the records. No man is for himself both claimant and witness. So far Tertullian. To Tertullian, Paul, with his writings and his witness for himself, the risen Christ next to him, they do not carry sufficient weight. They need the rubber stamp of others, the apostles, the Gospels, and Acts. And Tertullian states, "From Acts I am led even to believe Paul." Even if this argument that the credit of Paul depends on that of other documents, the Gospels and Acts, sounds just a rhetorical extemporization, it is more, as can be shown from other places in Tertullian's work against Marcion. Our rhetorician has been provoked by Marcion's emphasis on the apostle to reduce Paul's importance. Unlike for Marcion, for whom Paul was the core, the only apostle of truth, for Tertullian, Paul is a late apostle, so that even if Marcion had introduced his gospel under the name of Paul in person, that one single document would not be adequate for our faith if destitute of the support of his predecessors. Tertullian again. Or Paul, the latecomer, is rather an early bird, a preparation of the gospel to come, comparable to John the Baptist, the one, quote, "who girds our loins with truth and with the corset of righteousness, and shoes our feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace." Against the clatter and clamour of the opposite party of the Marcionites, who claim that the gospel was separated from the Jewish law in the beginning, Tertullian writes as follows. They, the Marcionites, allege that in separating the law and the gospel, Marcion did not so much invent a new rule as refurbish a rule previously debased. So then Christ, our most patient Lord, has through all these years become with a perversion of the preaching about himself until, if you please, Marcion should come to his rescue. They object that Peter and those others, pillars of the apostleship, were reproved by Paul for not walking uprightly according to the truth of the gospel. By that Paul, you understand, who, yet inexperienced in grace and anxious lest he had run or was running in vain, was then for the first time conferring with those who were apostles before him. So then, if, as still a neophyte, in his zeal against Judaism he thought something in their conduct called for reproof, their indiscriminate association, in fact, though he himself was afterwards to become in practice all things to all men, to the Jews as a Jew, to those under the law as himself under the law. Do you allege that reproof concerning conduct and nothing more, conduct which its critique was afterwards to approve of, must be supposed to refer to some deviation in their preaching concerning God. Tertullian was not only skeptical about Marcion, he also expresses his skepticism about Marcion's major anchor, Paul. Having studied the question of Christ's resurrection in early Christianity for years, this book is proposing a hypothesis, and it is that had Marcion, who taught after 140 AD at Rome, not picked up the letters of this disputed apostle Paul and put them together with a gospel on which we have to discuss later, the resurrection of Christ would presumably never have made its way into the Christian creed. There was another tenet and belief, the myth of God incarnate, which only slowly gave way, and never fully, to the other myth of Jesus, the risen Christ. Even 2 centuries later, when Roman emperors lent their influence to the promotion of the resurrection, it did not gain the same symbolic power as God's incarnation. So it remained in the West, while Eastern Christianity, fueled by Apollinaris of Laodicea, Athanasius and Cyril of Alexandria, but also by the Cappadocian Fathers, became the Church of Easter and of the risen Christ. Consequently, it was not from the year of Christ's resurrection that countries around the globe, West and East, began to count the years of a new era. Rather, it is and was the Lord's birth that is still referred to when we say Anno Domini.